أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وصلي عليه. This is a short video to give you a few basic masail with respect to Itekaaf. We are coming to the last 10 days of Ramadan this year, and I thought it would be useful to give a few basic pointers for Itekaaf. First thing is, what is Itekaaf? Itekaaf is the name given to the act of worship where an aqil baligh male, which means a person, a male of sound intellect of the age of puberty, when such a male person sits in seclusion in a Shari masjid where Jamaat for Salah takes place, and he sits in seclusion in such a masjid for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, free from all impurity. Alternatively, it is when an aqil baligh lady, a lady of sound intellect and the age of puberty, sits in seclusion in a place of worship in her home whilst she is free from all major impurity. A person in impurity, in a state of impurity, cannot enter the masjid, and therefore, of course, a male who is in a state of janaba, for example, cannot enter the masjid, cannot sit itikaaf. However, if a person is in itikaaf, is inside the masjid, and then it happens that he has ihtilam, release of bodily fluids, and he enters a state of janaba, that doesn't break his itikaaf. He can go, do ghusl, come back and continue with his itikaaf. So it's a question of, if a person is in the major state of impurity, he cannot start the itikaaf. If the major state of impurity occurs later, he can cleanse himself and continue the itikaaf. For a lady, she cannot enter itikaaf if she is in a state of haiz or nifas, so her monthly cycle or post-natal bleeding, so the bleeding that women suffer from after giving childbirth. If they're in any of those states of impurity, or of course in a state of janabat also, then they cannot begin their itikaaf. If they enter a state of impurity of haiz or nifas afterwards, and in that case it's most likely going to be haiz rather than nifas, but if they enter the major state of impurity during the itikaaf, that will break the itikaaf also. So in that situation, I have had a couple of sisters asking me that our time of the month will come during the last 10 days. We wanted to sit itikaaf. What should we do? I did explain that it will break your itikaaf. However, in modern times, there are tablets, there are medication available, which ladies can take, which delays their monthly cycle, and they can take those. It is permissible to take those tablets, delay the onset of the monthly cycle, so that they can get through the last 10 days and sit their itikaaf. Women also use these tablets when they go for Hajj and Umrah, so that their ibadat worship at Hajj and Umrah is also not interrupted by their monthly cycle. For men, it is a condition of itikaaf that a Shari masjid is the place of itikaaf. One where a muazzin and an imam are appointed. If there is such a masjid where there isn't an appointed imam or a muazzin, then that masjid cannot be a place of itikaaf. Likewise, if the masjid is not a Shari'i masjid. So for example, there are many centers, there are many musallas where salat takes place, where programs and other dawah work does take place, but the masjid is, or the center is, for example, in a public place. For example, it might be a room in a shopping center. It might be a room in a block of flats. It might be above commercial premises, for example. These types of places are not Shari'i masjids. The reason being that the accommodation of the masjid is temporary. In other words, it's being used for worship, but it is not waqf. It is not being given for the purposes of use as a masjid. In other words, the owner can at any time turn around and say, listen, I need my space back and I wish to sell it, I wish to renovate it, I wish to use it for another purpose, and then you would have to forfeit that space back to the owner. So there are many other conditions which I'm not going into today with respect to what a Shari'i masjid is, but again, that is a condition. It must be a Shari'i masjid where Itekaaf is sat, not any other type of masjid, and it must be a masjid where there is an appointed imam and muazzin. Even if 5 times salah jamaat does not take place in that masjid, it is still permissible to do itikaaf there as long as there is an appointed imam and muazzin. So that is a condition of itikaaf. That's of course for men, because it is men who sit in the masjid. For women, it is a place in the house which is used for worship, which is clean, which is pure, where worship can be conducted for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The primary condition for itikaaf is niyyah, intention. Intention must be made for itikaaf by the mu'takif, and that is crucial to the itikaaf. Now, I think the most important thing about itikaaf, not what you should do, but more so what you shouldn't do, what breaks your itikaaf. I think this is important to understand. First of all, leaving the masjid for any other reason other than a shari'i or tabi'i reason will break the itikaaf. Shari or tabi reason. You are permitted to leave the masjid for a shari or tabi reason. If you leave the masjid for any other reason, then that will break the fast, and I'll explain that in a minute. Cohabitation. So if you sleep with your husband or your wife, that will break your itikaaf. Kissing and cuddling with your wife or husband, which then releases to bodily fluids, this will also break the itikaaf. And the fourth thing which breaks the fast is if you break your fast, your roza, your sawm. If you break your fast, your itikaaf will automatically break. So another condition of itikaaf that we understand now is fast. For those people who do not fast, who have exemption in Sharia, they cannot sit itikaaf. They can sit nafli itikaaf, they cannot sit sunnah itikaaf, the itikaaf which we all understand in the last 10 days of Ramadan. So fasting is a condition for that also. What is hajat tabi? What is a tabi reason to leave the masjid? It means a bodily reason, a requirement that you have as a human. So for example, if your hajat to go to the toilet, to pass urine, or to pass to defecate, or so these types of reasons, or hunger, these are bodily human reasons to leave the masjid. So for example, if you leave the masjid to go to the toilet, which may be outside the masjid, that is acceptable, but you must go to the toilet and return back straight after performing your necessary act. of course, leaving the masjid for a shari reason. What is a shari reason? Something like making wudu. It is necessary for you to do wudu in order to conduct your worship, and therefore, if the wudu place is outside of the masjid, you can leave the masjid, go to the place of wudu, make wudu, and return back. But remember, when you do leave to make wudu, you must return back immediately. If you loiter around, hang around, start talking to people about this and that, or start wasting time, spending time unnecessarily outside of the masjid, that will break your itikaaf. So it's important that you return immediately back to your place of itikaaf. You can also leave the masjid for food. So if you don't have anybody who can bring you food or can make arrangements to provide food for you inside the masjid, then it is perfectly acceptable for you to go outside the masjid, in so much as it facilitates you to provide yourself with food. So to the nearest takeaway or to the nearest store, so you can go and buy yourself something, or to the nearest place where you can go to make yourself some food. That is permissible, and for as long as it takes you to fulfill your necessary requirement of obtaining food. If you spend any longer time than that outside of the masjid, then your itikaaf will break. In terms of the masjid itself, you can go anywhere inside the masjid during a state of itikaaf. That will not break your itikaaf. And the what is included in that is, of course, the hall, the prayer hall itself, the place where you read salah, the walls of the masjid, the roof of the masjid, the mihrab of the masjid, in many traditional masajids, especially in Eastern countries, you have the courtyard of the masjid, which is also part of the masjid. These places you can walk and go between easily during a state of itikaaf. Going outside the boundary of any of this, other than for the reasons that I have stated, for personal reasons in terms of for bodily reasons or for shari reason for doing wudu, then that will break your itikaaf. If there are shower facilities available inside the masjid, then they can be used if required, but remember that ghusl is only permitted in a state of itikaaf if ghusl becomes farz. In other words, if you have any release of bodily fluids, then of course you must do ghusl, and if the facilities are available at the masjid, then that is brilliant. If they are not, you are entitled to go to your house or to the nearest facilities where there are ghusl facilities. You make ghusl, you purify yourself, you then come back to your place of itikaaf and you carry on your itikaaf. It is not recommended to do sunnah ghusl during itikaaf. So you should not do ghusl other than for a wajib reason where you have entered a state of impurity. Other than that, doing wuzu, of course, is a condition, is a shart, is farz for your worship, and therefore it is fine for you to go as many times as is required to the place of wudu and to make your wudu. I just want to mention at this point smoking. There are many people who smoke, and again, if you leave the boundary of the masjid to smoke, that will break your itikaaf. What you can do, even though it's undesirable, is to sit on the wall of the masjid, or if there's a door which goes outside, leads outside of the masjid, and you stand inside the doorway with the door open, smoking outwards, that would be permissible in terms of it wouldn't break your itikaaf. Although it would be undesirable and disliked, it wouldn't break your itikaaf. Another point I want to mention here is that many people during itikaaf, when they're in the masjid may have programs, they may have gatherings, and therefore they often request the people sitting in itikaaf to assist with cooking, with other help for the gathering or for the function that is about to take place. That is perfectly fine as long as the mu'takifin remain inside the masjid. What they cannot do is, if the cooking facilities are outside of the masjid and they are then requested that it's fine for you to go outside of the masjid in order to serve people, to cook for them, and so on and so forth, that is incorrect. The mu'takif cannot leave the masjid for any other reason except the reasons that I have stated. So even if it is to cook for other people and to serve other people, if the place of cooking is outside of the masjid, then the mu'takif cannot go to that place and cannot cook, because it is an extra reason, it is an unnecessary reason. He can only leave the masjid for a necessary reason, for a bodily function, or for a shari reason, and I've already explained what those are. For a lady, her place of itekaaf, she selects that in her home, and again the same rules apply for her, except they will apply to her designated place in her house. She cannot leave that designated place unless she needs to go to the bathroom for bodily reasons, or she becomes impure and she needs to purify herself, or she needs to cook for herself, there's nobody else to provide for her, then she can leave. Otherwise she must remain inside her designated place of worship. If she leaves that place of worship for any other reason than those stated, or prolongs her stay beyond the necessary stay outside of her designated area, then that will break her itikaaf. I hope this has been useful. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept our efforts, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant everyone the ability to sit itikaaf and to benefit. Wa akru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.